Hello, everybody. Thank you for attending our program tonight, for the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge. My name is Tom Romito, and I am your host tonight. I am a board member of the Friends of Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, and I'm joined by a fellow board member, Chris Johnson. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization celebrating our 25th year, supporting Ohio's only national wildlife refuge with youth development, public use projects, and most recently, land acquisition and restoration. And we're located on the southern shore of Lake Erie near Oak Harbor, which is just east of Toledo, in some of the most critical wetland habitats in the world. If you're interested in learning more about us and what we do, we're going to add 3 links to the chat room in just a moment. These links will point you in the right direction to become a member, make a tax-deductible donation to support our work, to shop on our online nature store, to see what other virtual programs we have lined up for this year, and also to take a survey at the end of the program to tell us how well we did and how we can improve. So today I'm joined by Blake Mathys. Blake Mathys has graciously agreed to join us today to share his program. Now, Blake is an associate professor of environmental science at Ohio Dominican University. He majored in biology at Ohio Northern University and received his Ph.D. from Rutgers University in 2010. He's been fortunate to work with a variety of animals, from sparrows to elephant seals. He lives on a 60-acre farm in Union County, that's near Marysville, Ohio, with his wife and 2 daughters, and they've seen more than 100 bird species on their property. And Blake's going to talk about owls of Ohio. Owls are popular and charismatic birds, but they're secretive, and nocturnal habits make them hard to find and difficult to study. His project uses citizen science and targeted searches to gain a better understanding of the abundance and distributions of Ohio's rarest owl species. And with that, I'm going to say this. First of all, when you have questions, and undoubtedly you will, I'm going to ask that you hang on to them until the end. Now, you can put them into the chat room if you like, but we're going to entertain them at the end of the program, because that is our presenter's desire. So with that, Blake, you can take it away.
Great, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, about my owl research, and I'll be excited to, as Tom said, answer any questions you have at the end. All right, so start out here with just a little bit about who I am, how I ended up doing owl research. So I attended Ohio Northern University, did a major in biology and then a minor in field biology. After that, I went out to New Jersey to do my PhD at Rutgers. My research for my PhD was focused on birds that have been introduced to islands. So I had to go to a bunch of boring, terrible places like Bermuda and Puerto Rico and Hawaii and capture songbirds. As you might notice, we lack a lot of tropical islands here in Ohio, so that's one of the reasons that I've got to change over to this owl research. It's a lot easier to get to. In between my undergraduate and my graduate work, I worked as a field technician on various projects. So did some electrofishing for Ohio EPA, went out and worked with elephant seals in California, the endangered Cape Sable seaside sparrow down in Everglades National Park. And then I worked as a hawk counter for one season in Washington State. I got to get some diversity of experience with various organisms. Since 2012, I have been at Ohio Dominican University. If you're not familiar with Ohio Dominican, we're a small undergrad school in Columbus. I'm actually very fortunate. Ohio Dominican has Alum Creek running right through campus, which means that I'm able to just walk out the door and be out in good habitat or out in the creek, catching birds, catching fish, and kind of giving students that opportunity to get that hands-on experience with real life organisms. Now, my history with owls, it really starts back with my earliest interest in birds. I actually didn't really like birds, especially when I was very young. I was more interested in mammals. But then when I was in college, some of my friends said that they were going to go look for some birds. I didn't really know that much about it, but I decided I would go with them. And we went out and looked for birds and had a good time. And I started being pretty interested in birds, at least from the recreational viewpoint. In this picture here, I'm the person second from the left there. I'll also point out the person beside me is Mr. John Kinsley, who's also involved in my owl research. So he was one of the people who first got me interested in birds and has stayed with me and helped with various aspects of this owl research that you're about to hear about. One of the places that we would often go and look for birds was at Killdeer Plains Wildlife Area. Now, I didn't realize at the time, but there was kind of this special situation at Killdeer Plains that you could easily go and find some of the rarest owls of Ohio. Things like saw-whet owls, long-eared owls were easily found. We would go birding and we'd walk around and we'd go to the area where these owls spent the winter and we'd walk around and we'd always find multiple individuals of both. At the time, I just thought that was something kind of normal. But as I learned more about wildlife, I came to realize that that is not necessarily something that you would expect. And in most places, it's much, much, much harder to find those species. Now, as I went around and started traveling for my PhD research and so forth, I was always keeping an eye out for owls. They're charismatic, they're spectacular birds. And so I saw various species of owls in various places. And then when I started working at Ohio Dominican, I decided I would start having owl walks. That every year I would invite people out to our farm in Union County, and we would walk around in the dark and look for owls. After, of course, having a potluck meal and having a lot of good conversation. And we have been able to find on every owl walk that I've led, we've found at least one owl. So it was pretty successful. All right, so thinking about owls, they tend to be relatively secretive. As I started to think about actually studying owls, I started to ask the question, well, how do we survey species? How do we know what living organisms are around? For many wildlife species, they're relatively easy to observe. You can drive around and see them. They're not hard to find. Thinking about maybe something like white-tailed deer. Well, recently, citizen science has become this really important and powerful tool for wildlife biologists, which harnesses the fact that while most people aren't biologists, there are lots and lots and lots of people out there who can see living organisms, and because of the advent of the internet and social media, can easily report those sightings. So the idea being a very small fraction of the world are biologists, but everybody else can contribute. So why not take advantage of these people who are out there every day seeing things and using that information then to learn more about even sometimes rare and difficult to find species. Now, if you're familiar with birds, there's a citizen science project called eBird. This is the main citizen science approach to documenting birds. And eBird is basically this giant database where anyone can report their sightings of birds. So whoever you are, you can go to eBird and say, hey, I went out and I saw these bird species and there were this many individuals at this location on this date. And that goes into this huge database. Now, that database, not only does it contain this information, but it's publicly accessible. So for example, in the area where I live, here is a map showing reports of an American robin. American robin, relatively common species, relatively abundant, and as you can see, there are many, 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 many reports of American robins. If we look at some place like Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge, again, the landscape is pretty much dotted with reports. It's almost covering most places showing these American robins. And if you click on either of those orange or those blue dots, it will tell you, well, these is when American robins have been seen. This is how many were reported. And so you can see someplace like the Wildlife Drive at Ottawa, there's lots of robins that are seen, lots of robins that get reported. Now, you can also do lots of other things with these data. So for example, you can make bar charts showing when you're most likely to see a species over the course of the year. So this is a bar chart for the whole state of Ohio, showing that we have American robins around all the time, but they get reported more often during the summer. You can also do things like line graphs. This is the one showing the total number of robins being reported. And so you can see in this case with robins, we're talking about, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of individuals being reported. Well, I, of course, have this longer interest in owls. And so every once in a while, I would go to eBird and look up owl reports. Now, some parts of Ohio, the Ottawa National Wildlife Refuge area, we see that there are quite a few reports of, for example, long-eared owls. And you can see that they've been reported, well, quite a few places, especially along the lake shore there. But where I lived, down in Union County, there's not that many. In fact, we've got just a couple of reports of long-eared owls here in eBird. And actually, if we take a look at what they are, well, this one that's a little further south, and that was one that I reported back in 2013. And then the one further north, well, that was actually at my house. The individual that spent 4 days in some spruce trees next to our garage back in 2017. So this got me to thinking, boy, there must have been more long-eared owls in this area than just these ones that I've seen. That we probably we must be missing some of these owls that are around and either not seen or not reported. But of course, owls can be very difficult to find. There are these rare, quiet, especially during the time that they're here for some of the species in the winter, they may not make much vocalization. They tend to try to hang out in places that are relatively well concealed so that they don't get noticed by predators and eaten. They're camouflaged. They're active mainly at night. Well, that makes them hard to find, hard to know they're there. Even when they're present, we may not see them. And even if people do see them, sometimes they don't get reported. One of the reasons for this is that some types of owls are pretty sensitive to disturbance. So if birds are reported to the general public, and if those birds are relatively rare, we will sometimes have the situation where hundreds or maybe even sometimes thousands of people might show up to try to see a specific bird. Now, unfortunately, for owls, those activities of those people who are trying to see those birds, well, might cause some problems for the owls. The picture on the left here was an unfortunate situation a few years ago. I think it was in Oregon, where some people were walking around out basically right next to snowy owls that were trying to hunt, which of course may have an effect on whether those owls decide to stay in that area, how successful they are at hunting. And unfortunately, this is not an unusual occurrence when it comes to owls. Sometimes people make some bad decisions. And so maybe people who do know the owls that are there may not let other people know about it. There was a really unfortunate occurrence where a northern hawk owl showed up in Washington state. It attracted quite a bit of attention. But then unfortunately, the person whose property that northern hawk owl was on got so sick of people stopping on the road to try to look at this owl that he actually shot and killed this owl. So the point is that these owls are sensitive to disturbance and may not be reported because of some of these social problems that develop around owls. Additionally, just because somebody knows an owl is around doesn't mean that they know that someone like me would be interested in hearing about it. So I thought that probably a lot of people are seeing owls, but not reporting it. They're not interested in birds. They don't have that understanding that maybe maybe I would really like to know about it. So that led me to think, well, how could I maybe look into where these owls are, get a better idea of these owls' presence, their abundance, their distribution? How do we generally find hard to find animals? And there's a few different approaches. One is, and especially in the last 10 to 20 years, these automatic cameras, what we might call game cameras or trail cameras. They are able to survey an area 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and take a picture of whatever walks by. This has led to some really impressive rediscoveries and rediscoveries of various species of rare and difficult to find organisms around the world. Another possibility for finding rare species is by trapping. The picture here is a mouse that I caught with my ecology class at Ohio Dominican. We walk around campus all the time. We never see mice, but we put out traps and we are able to capture in these live traps, capture these mice and know that they're there. Tracking can be used. Even if species aren't seen, they often leave some evidence of their presence. Here's an article that was published about the rediscovery of the striped hyena in Armenia, and part of the evidence for that was the presence of a track showing that that species had been there. Finally, for some rare species, we rely on other species, for example, dogs, to help track them down. So for example, if I was studying, let's say, mountain lions, I would probably employ a team of tracking dogs that help to track that big cat down, which could then be tranquilized and collared or measured or whatever it might be. So I thought about this with relation to owls. And it turns out that none of these four approaches are going to be very successful when it comes to studying owls. Because owls are flying, they don't leave a scent trail for dogs to follow as easily. They don't leave tracks very often. Trapping is possible, but it's usually in a very limited geographical location. And the flight, again, of owls means that game cameras, well, often may not capture them. So I decided to start what I'm calling the Central Ohio Owl Project. And I wanted to figure out if there was a way to better document the location and abundance of the owls that are spending the winter in Central Ohio. I live in Union County, work in Franklin County at Ohio Dominican, and so I thought I'd concentrate on my local area. The first thing I had to do was figure out which species I wanted to study. Here in Ohio, we have 8 species of regularly occurring owls. Of these 8 species, they fall into one of 3 categories. The first of these categories, which has the screech owl, the great horned owl, and the barred owl, these species are not going to migrate. They're going to stay in Ohio year-round. They're relatively common. They're relatively widespread, and relatively, compared to some other owls, relatively easily found. So we've got a pretty good idea about where these species are found. They're not difficult to locate. We've probably got a pretty good handle on their status in Ohio. A couple of other species, snowy owl and short-eared owl, occur in Ohio primarily in the winter. One thing that separates them from most of our other owls is that they are often active during the daylight. Short-eared owls being active just primarily at dawn and dusk, and then snowy owls perhaps being active all day, meaning that it's easier for us to find them. It's easier for us to know that they're around because they are active when we can easily see them. All right, that leaves us then with our last group of owls. And these 3, the long-eared owl, northern saw-whet owl, and barn owl, tend to be very secretive. They tend to be strictly nocturnal. They're relatively rare. They're much harder to find and document. So because of that, I thought I would focus my research on these 3 species of owls and see what I could learn about their status in Central Ohio. I want to provide just a little bit of background here about these 3 species. So I'm going to start with our saw-whet owl. This is the smallest owl in the northern part of the continent. They're actually a little smaller than the screech owl, which is a pretty small owl to begin with. In Ohio, they may occasionally breed in the state. if they do, it's probably not every year, and if they are some, they're very limited numbers. When they breed, they're a secondary cavity nester, so that means they will use nests that have been made by things like woodpeckers. So they're sometimes a little bit limited by nest sites. They eat mainly mice. They'll also eat voles. They'll eat insects. They'll eat a variety of things. But white-footed mice, deer mice, tend to be one of their favorite food items. Now, we primarily get them in the winter. And in the winter, they tend to roost in really thick vegetation. Evergreen trees, grapevine tangles, places where they can really be very well hidden. In Ohio, the state considers them to be a species of special interest, which kind of means that they're present but rare. We're kind of on the edge of their breeding range, and so they're not considered to be something like an endangered species just because we're kind of at the periphery here, but not something of necessarily conservation concern. All right, let's talk about the long-eared owl. Long-eared owls are found worldwide in the northern hemisphere. Once again, a few of them may breed in Ohio. These will actually take over the nests of hawks and crows, steal those nests from them and use them. Sometimes, even if they're occupied, the owls will drive away the hawks or the crows and take over the nest. They eat a variety of small mammals. They'll eat other things also, but small mammals make up the majority of their diet, especially things like voles. And similar to the saw-whet, they like to spend their winters roosting in thick evergreen trees, especially pines and spruces. Another species of special interest, so found in the state, but sort of on the periphery and a little bit rare. Finally, my third species of interest is the barn owl. Barn owls are found basically worldwide, all continents except for Antarctica. In Ohio, they are present year-round. They do breed in Ohio. There's probably fewer than 1,000 barn owls that stay in Ohio. They rely heavily on nest boxes that people put mainly in their barns, and the presence of those nest boxes has greatly increased the number of barn owls that are found here in Ohio. In the 1990s, the ODNR pushed for installation of a lot of those nest boxes, and it's really helped the barn owl population. They also eat a lot of rodents, and the ones that stay here for the winter will often stay in buildings. They can also use evergreen trees, but they will often find old barns, old silos, church steeples, places, those sorts of structures to spend the winter. Their status in Ohio is that they are considered threatened. So present, low population, not quite endangered, but a threatened species. All right, so this then led to me to figure out how am I going to find if these owls are actually present. There were two approaches. I wanted to make targeted searches to look for them and also ask for sightings. The targeted searches came about from the fact that as I drive around and I spend time around the countryside in Ohio, I will often notice areas of thick evergreen trees. And I'll think to myself, I should really be looking for owls. Is anybody checking those for owls? And so I thought, if I go out and spend my time searching in those areas that look like they could be good owl wintering habitat, maybe I'll find owls that nobody else is looking for. So that meant I spent my winter along with John Kinsley that I mentioned before. We spent a lot of time wandering around through thick stands of evergreen trees, seeing if we could find owls. Looking for owls is basically just a slow process of walking through the trees, looking carefully, looking often for, even if you don't see the actual owl, signs of owls. So these are a picture here that shows what we would call the whitewash. This is basically just the owl feces that if they roost in the same spot over and over again, you end up with this buildup. Sometimes it really looks like whitewash, like you've taken white paint and painted the branch with it. These pictures, well, the one on the right is an area where a long-eared owl had been roosting for a long time, and you can see there's this big buildup. So that helps to show if there might be owls in the area. And then of also, of course, looking for owl pellets, these regurgitated remains, the hair and bone that can't be digested that the owls regurgitate. And you can use these also as a clue to the identity of the owls that produce them. I'll make this, I have a PDF of this graphic here that I'll make available in the chat room after the talk's over. It gives you some idea of the differences in the various different species of owls and their pellets. The second part of my research, in addition to just looking for owls, was to try to get people to report sightings. So Ohio Dominican helped me to produce a form where anybody could go to this website and click on a link, fill out a form and say, hey, this is an owl that I saw. Here's where I saw it. I, of course, wanted to respect everybody's confidentiality, so I only asked for the county, maybe a township or zip code if they wanted to reveal that. But just to say, we saw this owl. If you have a picture, to submit that picture to provide some evidence that owl was there. Ohio Dominican's marketing department helped to develop a graphic that could be shared on social media. I also reached out to a lot of different newspapers, magazine, radio. Here's an article that was in the Ohio Cooperative Living magazine. This goes out statewide to people who are members of electric cooperatives, so goes to circulation of hundreds of thousands, talking about the project and asking for sightings. There's some of the newspaper articles, some local papers. The Columbus Dispatch did articles about the project, encouraging people, if you've seen an owl, report it to this project. Now, I knew that a lot of the owls that would be reported would not be those 3 species that I was really targeting, but I also knew it can be difficult to identify owls. So I wanted to make sure I didn't miss a rare owl because somebody wasn't sure of which species of owl they saw. So I said, report everything. Give you some idea of the results. I was pretty happy with the success. Over 1,600 reports were submitted from across the state. Many of these had photographs associated with them. So for example, here's some of the favorite pictures that were submitted by people who had seen barred owls, various places around the state. I discovered that barred owls are the most often seen and the most often photographed owls in Ohio. Similarly, things like eastern screech owls, commonly seen. I discovered that if somebody has an owl in their house or in their garage, it is most often an eastern screech owl. A lot of pictures from people's houses. I really like the picture on the right where it's sitting on the railing there looking at the person who just walked out the door. But I also, of course, had reports then of the rare species that I was focused on. So for example, northern saw-whet owl, here's a collection of some of the pictures that were submitted of the saw-whets. I especially want to point out the one on the far left there. This report was from the Cleveland area. And along with a picture, this person included this part. Here's part of the message. It seemed to be a tiny baby, had to have been smaller than my palm. It was first next to my tire on my car near my driveway. So here's somebody who is not familiar with owls, didn't know saw-whet owls even existed, thought this was a baby owl. They walked out to their car to go to work in the morning, and there's an owl standing next to their tire of their car. Took the picture, submitted it. I was able to tell them this is a saw-whet owl based on the time of year. It's probably migrating through. These are exactly the sorts of reports that I was trying to get of where somebody who would never have reported this to eBird or told a birder about it. And now we have this information and know that it was there. I also got long-eared owl reports. I especially want to highlight the picture on the right, just because it's one of the best pictures I've ever seen of a long-eared owl. This was a couple who said they were walking their dog in the morning. And as they were walking along, the dog happened to notice the owl and kind of pointed it out to them. And they looked up, and there was this long-eared owl perched out in the open, which is pretty unusual for them. They were able to take great picture. They saw it in the morning when they walked the dog. In the afternoon when they walked the dog, they saw it again, and then it was gone the next day. I also got some reports of long-eared owls, and these are still kind of shocking to me, where people reported these long-eared owls that were literally perched just outside their bedroom windows. So I had 2 different reports of this, one from Allen County and one from Union County, where they had multiple long-eared owls that spent the winter in trees that were just 4 or 5 feet outside of their bedroom windows. In fact, you can see in the picture on the right, that's the looking out the bedroom window. In the bottom right corner there, that's the end of my spotting scope where I'm taking some pictures of the owl from just a few feet away. That these people were able to just walk around their house and look outside and see long-eared owls. I never thought I would be standing in my sock feet in someone's bedroom looking through a window at long-eared owls, but it actually happened twice during this winter of research. I also got reports of barn owls, not as many as I had expected. There were some. They were mainly from the areas of the state, the eastern and southeastern Ohio, where we expect barn owls to be. So I expected to get more, but I did get some. We can actually look at the numbers here. John Kinsley and I took all of these owl reports, and over 1,600 submitted, and of them, we were able to assign 844 to species with some confidence. Either there was a really good description reported, or there was a photograph that we could be pretty sure which species they were talking about. Of those, as I mentioned, barred owls were the most numerous. Great horned owls, screech owls, also relatively abundant and numerous owls. The other species were lower. Barn owl, only 19 reports, which kind of surprised me. Saw-whet owls, 31. Long-eared owls, 26. So some reports, but I guess as expected for these rare secretive owls, much lower than the more common, more abundant owls. I also found an interesting result that still kind of surprises me. Before doing this project, I would have said that owls were unmistakable, that everybody knows what an owl looks like, and you wouldn't be able to confuse any other bird for an owl. But in fact, I actually got more reports that showed hawks than I did long-eared owls. That very commonly people report pictures that usually were red-shouldered hawks and had identified them as being owls. So that was just something interesting, something that I hadn't thought about, and of course shows some of the issues with using citizen science data, that you can't always necessarily rely on the skill set of everybody to be able to report what you think they're reporting. That's why photographs can be so especially useful for this. Now, in addition to those reports, we went out and did those targeted searches. We went out and looked for owls in specific locations, places that seemed likely to hold owls. We ended up being able to look for owls in 5 different counties. Those tended to be the 5 counties closest to where I live, which I guess isn't surprising. Our first search for owls, this was a location in Union County on December 28th, 2020. John Kinsley and I went out and almost immediately found 3 saw-whet owls. This was certainly some validation for the research because we were able to so quickly find owls that we were looking for. In total, our luck did not hold up the entire time like that, but we were able to find multiple individuals of the saw-whets and the long-eared owls and 1 barn owl based on these targeted searches. Now, actually, I'm going to use some data, and I'm going to look here specifically at Union County to kind of show what some of these data mean. So for the 3 species of interest here, in the first column, I'm going to put the number of individual of that type of owl that's been reported by eBird prior to my research project, which started in 2020. So what we're going to see here is no saw-whet owls have been reported in Union County. Barn owls have been reported twice, and long-eared owls have been reported 3 times. Based on the reports that I received in the project and the owls that we went out and actually found, we found 3 saw-whets, we found 1 barn owl, and we found 5 long-ears. So in other words, for saw-whets and long-ears, we were able to find more individuals and have reported more individuals in a single winter than had ever been reported on eBird before. So that's one of my main takeaways of this project is I want to get really a better idea of how many of these owls are present. And to then kind of ask the question, how good is eBird at monitoring these owl populations. For relatively abundant, relatively obvious species, eBird probably works pretty well. For these rare, relatively secretive species, is eBird going to do a good job of keeping track of population trends? Another part of the project is that I have some interest in maybe undertaking some kind of long-term interventions. So for example, putting up owl boxes for barn owls in barns. Maybe long-eared owls have been found to use like wicker baskets as nests. If you put wicker baskets in areas that they might want to nest, they'll use those. So maybe use our understanding of where these owls are spending the winter in order to perhaps increase their breeding populations here in Ohio. And that's kind of maybe a long-term goal for the project. I was also able to do some other aspects of owl research that I'll just kind of mention here quickly. One of the things that I've been doing the last couple of years is banding saw-whet owls. It turns out that saw-whet owls, when they're migrating, they are very strongly attracted to the saw-whet owl sound, and so you can attract them while they're migrating, capture them in mist nets. You can see the picture on the far left there. There's a saw-whet owl in a net, and then band them, measure them, and of course release them so that we can learn things about where they might go, how long they live, all those sorts of things that you can only find out if you can keep track of individuals of a species. Here's a picture, a close-up of one of the bands that goes on the saw-whet owl's leg. So each band has this unique number, gets reported to a federal database that keeps track of all these banding records, so that if anybody ever sees this owl again, they can say this owl was seen at this location, and we can then have a lot of useful information about where that owl's gone and how long it's lived and so forth. There are other people who ban saw-whet owls here in Ohio. This map just kind of shows in orange or other saw-whet owl banding operations. So Union County, where I live in the middle there in blue, I'm the only one kind of in central Ohio that's banding saw-whet owls. So maybe adding a little bit of a coverage to that saw-whet owl banding that happens here in Ohio. I started this in the fall of 2020, was able to band 15 saw-whets. In the spring of 21, I was able to get 1. And then last fall, I was able to capture 14. And I will also be continuing this and banding owls again this fall. I have had some results from this already. So for example, this owl, I banded on November 9th at our house in Union County, November 9th, 2020. March 18th, 2021, unfortunately, this owl was hit by a car and killed in Ontario. So some information, so probably it spent the winter farther south of where that I caught it, and then was heading back north to the breeding grounds when unfortunately it was hit and killed. This owl I banded on November 8th of 2020, and then 15 days later was recaptured down at a banding operation north of Cincinnati, you can see there. So that's 15 days and traveled a total of 68 miles. So an average migration speed of about 4.5 miles per day, although probably they don't migrate every night, but we'll stop off for a while and then undertake a longer flight and then stop again. Now, interestingly, this exact same individual was recaptured the following migration, December 8th, 2021, at that same banding site in southern Ohio there. So this individual is apparently following a pretty similar pattern of migration from year to year. This owl was originally banded in September 2020 up in Ontario, far eastern Ontario. And then I captured it on October 24th of 2020, was able to see that it was banded, read the band and find out where it had been traveling to. That's about 40 days and 530 total miles that owl had traveled. This more recent fall, there was an owl that was banded up on Kelly's Island by Tom Bartlett, who does a lot of owl banding up there. He banded on November 4th. I captured it on November 23rd. 19 days, 93 miles, close to 5 miles per day on average of movement there. And then also during last fall, one, I cut my beard off, but fortunately it's growing back now. And two, I captured this saw-whet that was originally banded over in Quebec, and then showed up 54 days later, traveling 870 total miles to get down to where I am in central Ohio. So a lot of interesting results based on those banding returns, and also showing there's a lot more saw-whet owls that are out there than we usually find. Something that's kind of crazy about saw-whet owls and owls in general is they have this really interesting pigment called porphyrins. Porphyrins are this pigment that shows up as a fluorescent pink under a black light. And so if you shine a black light on, for example, an owl's wing feathers, it glows this pink coloration. And we can use that coloration to help figure out the age of the owl. So in this case, this owl's wing shows all the feathers are pretty equally pink. That's because those feathers are all the same age. And that's because this owl is going to be have hatched that earlier that year. This owl is less than a year old and is showing a similar age of all the feathers. On the other hand, older owls, as they've gone through molts and have molded some feathers but not others, we can see that there are different ages of feathers there. And so in this case, this owl is what we're going to call after second year. So it's going to be at least 3 years old because it has molted multiple times. We got multiple ages of feathers. Now, during my banding for saw-whet owls, I also sometimes accidentally capture screech owls. Screech owls, sedentary, present year-round, but they occasionally fly into the nets. And so I've been able to catch and band a few. I especially have to point out the owl on the far right there. This is this red morph screech owl, which is exceptionally cute. My wife and I have an ongoing discussion about whether screech owls or saw-whet owls are cuter. That screech owl certainly is awfully cute, but I still think it's saw-whet. But that is quite a cute owl. Additionally, I've started to do a little bit of banding of long-eared owls. So at one of the locations that had the multiple long-eared owls outside their window, I was able to go there and capture and band 3 of those long-eared owls. And actually got a band return on one of those. So I originally banded them in March of 2021. And then in December, unfortunately, one got trapped inside of a building up in Cleveland and was found dead there December 10th. So probably had gone up north, spent the breeding season up in Canada, most likely, and was on its way back south. And unfortunately, did not survive. Useful information, good to know, but it's unfortunate that that owl died. I also recently gained some experience with barn owl banding. So I would like to get into this more in the future, but a couple pictures of banding some young barn owls. Since the barn owls nest in boxes, it's relatively easy to take them out of the boxes and then band them and have ended up with a banded population of barn owls. So I was able to accompany a barn owl researcher from Eastern Ohio and do some barn owl banding to learn about that process and see how all that worked. I mentioned the owl pellets before. I've been picking up owl pellets whenever I find them. So I now probably have, I don't know, over 1,000 owl pellets. And I've been thinking about doing kind of the standard research with them, taking a look at what the owls have been eating based on what sort of bones end up in the owl pellets. But I'm also collaborating with Dr. Annie Witzke here at Ohio Dominican to try to do some environmental DNA work with the owl pellets, to maybe learn more about them based on DNA that could be extracted from them. So that'll be something interesting to move forward with in the future. All right, I have just a few acknowledgments here, but they're important ones. I especially have to acknowledge Columbus Audubon. Columbus Audubon Society gave me a research grant to help fund this owl project. So a lot of what I did, I would not have been able to do without their funding. So I really appreciate that. Ohio Dominican's marketing and public relations helped put together some of the graphics, helped us be able to spread the word about the owl project. Aiden Van Fossen is one of my former students. He's helped with some of this research and has also contributed some of the owl pellets, including the snowy owl pellet, which of course is pretty tough to come across. And of course, the landowners, the public, I would not have been able to do this project without permission from people to get out onto their property and look for owls, without people submitting their sightings. That was, of course, essential to the success of the project. And then, of course, I have to thank my wife and daughters who have put up with a lot of late nights with the sound of Saw-whet owls playing in the background as I try to attract them to catch and band them, and have been overall very supportive of their unusual husband and father walking into the house holding a barred owl or whatever it might be. That is maybe not the everyday experience of most children. All right, so thank you very much. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen sharing here, and I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a remarkable audience. All 42 of you have remained with Blake to hear all about the owls. And what I see in the chat room is from Jennifer. She says, I have an owl box to put up, but no good tree to put it in. Will a pole or post work? And she's in the Cleveland area.
Yes, a pole or a post can definitely work for that as long as it's securely attached. In fact, it might be better in some ways. One of the things you have to worry about with owl boxes is things like raccoons getting access to them. So if you can mount it sturdily to a pole and then put some sort of baffle, something there to prevent those predators from getting up to it, then yeah, that can definitely work. And you know, the only way, I don't know if it's a screech owl box or a barn owl box, but if you try it and put it up, they will usually find it relatively quickly. I put up a screech owl box at our house, and within a year or two, I had screech owls in there successfully nesting, I believe.
Blake, Devin has said the upside down metal trash can around the pole apparently is a technique.
Yeah, that can be a good baffle to try to keep those mammalian predators from making it up there. Absolutely.
And Carlene says the migrant path can be long. Do owls travel alone?
So yes, they're traveling. They're not taking off and flying in flocks like we might see some species of birds doing. They do tend to migrate at the same time. So they're not like cohesive groups that are migrating together, but they are probably multiple individuals migrating around the same time and maybe in the same general area. So they're not staying together necessarily, but they are migrating at the same time at the same place.
Okay, and Blake, Dorothy says, where do you get an owl box? I have woods behind my property, but hickory, oaks mostly, no evergreens.
Yeah, they don't necessarily need evergreens for well, especially the saw-whets and the long ears. They prefer evergreens for the winter, but for the breeding season, something like a screech owl box can be put, actually hardwoods like hickories and oaks are ideal for them. You can buy owl boxes from various like Wild Birds Unlimited and stores like that. They're relatively inexpensive, and they're likely to be successful.
Great. And Lisa asks, what can we birders do to help the owl population?
So I would say, and it's one of the things that I try to do, the biggest thing that owls need is habitat. So especially grassland habitat for a lot of our owls that support these large populations of things like voles and mice are really key to the owls being successful. And then so if you can support habitat conservation in any way, that's going to be helpful. And then the other thing is just education. a lot of people don't even know these owls are around. They don't know they're there. They don't know they're anything they should even worry about. And so just getting the story out there that these owls exist, that's key to helping change minds, hearts, laws about how these owls can be successful.
Okay. Blake Maribeth says, owls are fascinating, but I have pet chickens. I live in Akron, and what type of owls should I worry about?
The owls that are most likely to eat chickens would be great horned owls. It does happen occasionally. Occasionally I'll get a call or an email from somebody who says, I have this owl in my chicken coop. What should I do? The key is just to make sure that you have a coop that the chickens can be closed up at night. I know we have pet chickens at our house, and I always have to make sure the chickens have gone into the coop for the night. Sometimes I'll even be picking up the chicken and say to the chicken, I hear a great horned owl right now. Why wouldn't you go into the coop? This is a good way to get eaten. So, but as long as they're kept in, if they're protected from raccoons, they're protected from owls too.
And Blake, Kristen asks, after the owl eats, how long does it take them to expel the pellets?
Yeah, so they're going to be producing probably 1 or 2 pellets per day. So it's something like 8 to 12 hours after they eat. I think if they eat more, they'll produce more pellets more quickly. But I had that long-eared owl that spent 4 days at our house. It ended up producing, I think it was right around 16 pellets. So a couple pellets. If they're larger pellets, then there's not going to be as many of them.
And Melanie asks, how can I find owl pellets?
The key to finding owl pellets is just walking around and looking down. That's what I do, is I just walk around areas that seem likely, especially if it's evergreen trees, walk around, look at the ground. I've discovered that there are a lot of things out there that look like owl pellets but are not owl pellets. And so it takes a little bit of learning to figure out what is an owl pellet, what's a piece of bark, what's a mushroom. But with a little bit of time, you kind of get an eye for it. And then that whitewash that I mentioned, those owl feces, are usually present where there are pellets. So if you see a little splatter of white, that's a good area to start looking at more carefully. And you'll often find if you notice one pellet, then all of a sudden you'll notice there might be a lot. And then when that happens, make sure you look up and see if there's an owl up above them.
And Blake, Brianna asks, can you determine what species an owl pellet is from, or does that require DNA testing?
So some of the pellets are really obvious, and you can just kind of look at them and say, that owl pellet's really small, that must be from a saw-whet. Barn owls produce disproportionately large pellets, huge pellets, that are real black, and so those tend to be really obvious. But for some of the kind of the middle size of pellets, so maybe like short-eared owl versus long-eared owl versus barred owl, there's enough variability that it's probably not easy to be real certain which one it is. I went ahead, I just put into the chat the PDF of the pictures of 5 different species of Ohio owls to give you some idea of the sizes and the difference in appearance. So take a look at that, but you can be pretty sure, but not necessarily certain for some of them.
And Blake, Kim says, my parents still live in Monroe County. Are there any species in that area that need support in terms of the owl boxes?
I would say that you should, screech owl boxes are relatively small, relatively easy to put up. You may as well go ahead and put those up. There's plenty of screech owls, but we could always use more. For the other owls, they are going to be most successful if there are grasslands, grassy areas nearby. I think Monroe County has some of the old reclaimed strip mine areas, and so those areas could be definitely good for barn owls. So barn owl boxes would also be a good idea. No guarantee. Barn owls apparently need something like a minimum of 40 acres of grassland in the nearby vicinity, but it couldn't hurt to try.
Blake, I have a question of my own. In 2020, just as COVID was breaking, my wife and I went to Erie Street Cemetery downtown Cleveland, and the leaves had not come out onto the trees yet. And I walked around a tree, and lo and behold, about 20 feet from me, about eye level, was sitting a barn owl in clear daylight. And we put the word out to our network, and within minutes, there were a whole crowd of people there who were, they were distancing, but they were there. And we were wondering, what is this owl doing there in April?
Yeah, I would assume that owl was migrating, making its way through. Barn owls do migrate, and so probably that one ended up at that location and decided that was the place it was spending the day. And during migration, sometimes they might choose places that they wouldn't want to spend the winter, but for that day, that's where it was.
Okay. I see no more questions in the chat room. Here's one. Good goodness. Jennifer says, I hear an owl close to my house both day and night. Where there is one, are there more? Or potentially just one? I hear it almost daily since this past winter.
That's a good question. They're going to be using the sound to advertise for mates. If you're hearing the same sound all the time, it may just be that there's one there. I know at our house, we have great horned owls that nest in our woods, and I hear them almost all the time, but I only hear both the male and the female occasionally. So there's probably a pair there. They may be reproducing. If it's great horned owls, they start nesting in the winter, so they may have already nested, but it'd be interesting to know if there actually is a nest, or is it just a single individual out there trying to attract mates.
Thank you. And Nathan says, are porphyrins present in all owl species feathers, and why would UV reactive compounds be present in owl feathers?
Nate Sin, what are you doing here? Nate and I went to undergrad together, and I haven't seen him for 20 years. Yes, porphyrins seem to be present in all owl feathers. It's not as useful for aging in some of the other species because of the order in which they molt their feathers. We find porphyrins in a variety of birds, not just owls. Of course, pigments serve functions other than just coloration. They can help with things like fighting off degradation by bacteria. They can provide structural support. Generally, when we find porphyrins in bird feathers, they tend to be in places that are usually concealed, like under the wings. And so they're serving functions other than coloration in this case.
And Blake, Gail asks, is southeastern Ohio a good place to search for owls such as Gallia County?
Yeah, there are owls everywhere. I mean, certainly the barred owls, great horned owls, screech owls, they are present in every county and most of those places in good numbers. So as for the other species, again, the grassland habitat is kind of the key. So if there's a large grassland area, especially if there are things like evergreens close to it, there's a good chance you could find those other owls.
Thank you. Well, gang, we are winding down. We're coming up to the top of the hour, and I see no more questions in the chat room. If you have any final words for the good of the order, you can press your space bar and ask Blake a question out loud. I'll give you a moment to ponder that opportunity. Hearing none, I see some thank yous in there. And so, ladies and gentlemen, please take that survey. Chris has just sent you that link again to tell us how you think the program went, how we can improve it. If there is a way to improve this, I don't know what it is, but tell us what you think. So with that, I'm going to bid you all good night, and thank you, Blake, for giving us this great presentation.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
It's our pleasure, and good night to you all. Good night now.
Nate, send me an email.